Hello, and welcome to part two, Employment Services Beyond the Basics. I'm Kara Thrasher Livingston with Senior and Disability Services Training, and this is the second part of our series all about employment services. In this section, we'll go over employment services. We'll have a brief history, core philosophy, and training requirements for our providers who are doing employment services with people who use them in their agency. Let's talk a bit about employment services. Where did they come from? What are some of the traditions around employment services? This is a pretty brief rundown of what the history is, and there's a lot more to discover. So if you are curious about that, you can check our resources section for different readings that you can engage with about the topic. It's very interesting. So, thinking back to 1918, vocational rehabilitation programs were established. This was to help soldiers returning from World War I who were recovering from injuries to regain jobs. It was thought that people were coming home from war and they should be able to get assistance to go back to the jobs or do jobs that they were able to do or could regain abilities to do. And it was seen as very important to include our soldiers returning. And this was an act by Congress. It was also extended generally to people with disabilities overall. And the field of assistive technology and prosthetics had a big growth during this period. Lots of discoveries made, and some of the early assistive technology was developed. So, being as you can't get where we are now without starting someplace, it's interesting and important to learn about the very beginning of employment services. And we've given our timeline source here. I know it's a big long link, but check our resources for more. Educate yourself about the origins of employment services. Moving forward to 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was intended to protect workers from unfair pay practices and regulations. So, as you know, all legislation and changes in legislation come from advocacy. So, this came from workers and people raising their concerns so they could inform legislators who would then, an act would be introduced and they would vote on it. In this law, there was an exception which allowed payment for certain groups of workers, including workers with disabilities, to be paid less than minimum wage. Now, that was changed later on in history. You'll see that. The vocational rehabilitation program is from 1943. This was about services for people with intellectual disabilities and behavioral health conditions to work. It also included people with little or no work history. So the thought was that people could work and be gainful, productive members of society. They experienced a disability, they needed services and supports to address that. And the thought was that people should work. Work was very important in this era. And to be productive as an adult, one needed to work. So the vocational rehabilitation program started to help with that. In the 50s, there was a parent advocate group. State hospitals and state resources, state schools for children, and in some cases, adults, young adults who experience disability, particularly developmental disability, and probably blended with mental health diagnoses as well. Parents began to advocate because they wanted to have their loved ones get support in the community rather than having their children have to move out of home just because they have a disability and needed extra care. People stood up for themselves and their family members, saying that my family member can be a valued member of our society and has value in our community, has a personality and a life of their own. And some of the different agencies that are bigger agencies we know about now, like the ARC, it's a national organization, the ARC of the United States. This was started by parents originally, and there are other bigger agencies that were started by parents as well. And some of them were focused around a particular disability, such as Down syndrome or something like that. But there was a lot of activism going on in the 50s from parents about children with disabilities. In the 60s, sheltered workshops came into existence. Now, there's a lot more history around these too. Thinking about children growing into people of work age, the Special Education Act idea came about as well later, a little bit later on, and states began to understand that they needed to work together and with their community supports together with our federal oversight for home and community-based services to create a transition from youth to work age to adulthood with meaningful engagement with work and your living place, being who you are, the freedom to express yourself and support to do so, participating in your health, participating in the community at large, being active with supports as a member of your community. But it was all part of a bigger story. None of these laws acted in isolation. But in terms of employment services, in the 60s, there were sheltered workshops. These were actually started about out as preparation for work. So it was all about preparing for work. A lot of the people who were engaging in this were people who did actually need quite pervasive supports. So these were people who needed more help. Maybe they could do some piecework or something like that. Um, then again, the lens of looking backwards into time like that is a little different too, because many of the people who probably did this were people who don't really need as much supports as people we regard today as needing many, many supports. So the lens changed over time as well. But sheltered workshops were a place for people to work. And so they did piecework and earned sub minimum wage. So usually a company would contract with the sheltered workshop for a product that the people would then assemble, and they would earn a sub minimum wage for that. The options for adults for day activities, for things to do with your adult life each day, was sheltered workshops and day activities, kind of like day hab, but before day hab. This group activities with your peers. The sheltered workshop was not a real work for real pay situation. It was piecework, and it was also not located in the community. It was in its own workshop. And so they people were successful and people were voiced that they were happy. So this is what I put out there when I want you to think about how it became the definition of employment for quite a long time. If you have a disability, this was where you could work. This is where you belong. This is where you could feel productive and get your peer group and your, you know, satisfaction from work and a little bit of pay. But it wasn't real work for real pay. It was not alongside other people who are doing the same work who don't have a disability. Mostly the bosses and the support folks did not have a disability, and they also did not do the piecework. So that's kind of the hallmark of a sheltered workshop. A sheltered workshop is not employment services, so the waiver does not pay for that kind of a setting for people to work. All right, employment services moving forward in time to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission of 1964. This commission enforced federal civil rights laws. It offered education and technical assistance for the public and groups of people who would put forth problems to be solved. Employees could seek help under the authority of this commission. So, this is an important concept too. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission came about alongside several other civil rights movements of the time. And it was part of shaping what we know today for employment services. In 1973, there was an act called the Rehabilitation Act, and this prioritized services for people with severe disabilities. So when I say that, I mean people who need pervasive supports. Okay, that means a person needs help most of the day, somebody there almost all of the time to help that person be successful in their life and their choices and their health and safety during the day and sometimes at night. Um, Section 503 of this act called for affirmative action in hiring persons with disabilities, and Section 504 prohibited discrimination against persons with disabilities. So a person could not be discriminated against solely because they happen to experience a disability. And this was building off of people's strengths and people's ability to perform in a workplace with supports. So 1973 was an important year around these thoughts. In 1986, supported employment was included in an amendment to the Federal Rehabilitation Act. And in the 80s, you'll see these different characteristics come about. In the early 80s, supported employment, competitive work in integrated settings for individuals with severe disabilities. So the employment services started out sort of reaching out to people who were not given a chance to do work or experienced a severe disability. Maybe they lived in settings that were not inclusive. Maybe they tried different work settings and it didn't work out because they didn't have the right supports, or maybe the work wasn't interesting to them. So my point here is that it started out to serve people who needed pervasive supports, experiencing severe disability. Contrast that with someone who, needs just a few supports during the workplace. Maybe somebody needs some workplace accommodations to be successful. That is a different category of worker. This was to serve a person who really had a lot of barriers to successful employment, be they disability or other resources that were not available to the person. So they were trying to serve people who were not employed, underemployed, or working with intermittent success due to their disability. And these laws also were alongside or parallel with the home and community based movement. So people did no longer wanted to live in an institution. Um, People were doing a lot of advocacy around access to the home and community at this time, and even a little bit before this and after. Um, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, but work continues to be seen as an extremely important way to spend your time and achieve satisfaction and make a worthy contribution to your culture and your people and yourself um, at a job. As I said in our previous unit, it's sometimes how an adult defines themselves. Who are you and what do you do for work? That's very important in terms of acceptance and being a part of the regular community, being included. In the 90s, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the ADA. Very common. You probably have heard of this one. You may already know quite a bit about it. It was about equal access to places, spaces, employment, modes of transportation, education, and communication for all. As with all laws, they do have amendments and readoptions and things like that. It was amended in 2008 and had a couple other um, additions to it regarding technology and things that were, new inventions, so to speak. So this is just a nutshell, very small version of the ADA here, the summary. Just know that it's huge compared to this. Uh, TWWIIA is Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act from 1999. That was a way for people to use our federal resources through states to access work. SSDI, Social Security Disability, and SSI, Supplemental Security Insurance, disability beneficiaries with a ticket. It provided them with a ticket that they can use to obtain a vocational employment, or I'm sorry, vocational rehabilitation, VR services, employment service, and other support services. So if a person met eligibility through SSDI or SSI, they could potentially get a ticket to work. And some of those, when I say work, some of those services may have been or are considered short term as opposed to long term through employment services with the waiver. Um, we'll get more into that in just a bit. Okay, in 1990, we also had the IDEA, Education for All Children with Disabilities, the Workforce Investment Act of 1998. These work together to create workforce investment systems in each state, which were intended to provide services and support that increase employment, retention, and earnings of all people in the state, including people with disabilities. So this was a time of good legislation supporting individuals and families. I spoke briefly just now about the institutional setting and how people wanted to move away from that. Olmsted is the famous case which laid groundwork and preceded the home and community-based waiver. In 1999, this Olmsted briefly was a case brought by two women in the state of Georgia who experienced behavioral health conditions and intellectual developmental disability. They were living in an institution and had completed their program within the institution according to their medical providers. They were done. They learned everything. They were finished and ready to live in the community. They still needed supports because their intellectual developmental disability created the need for supports. But they were told that they could not move into the community with supports because there was simply no language in Medicaid rules about that to support anyone doing that. So there's no language, there's nothing in there about community services. Even though there was legislation supporting that, there was nothing about a person who was getting institutional level of care moving into the community. So they did oppose that and sue and won the case. And it was found that it was against the ADA to enforce that just because there was no language. It's a very brief synopsis of it. Again, it's got a whole history that you can explore and our resources if you like. Um, but they created the groundwork for the home and community-based waiver and employment services that we're talking about in these lessons are long-term services and supports. So after a person accesses the federal and state resource of um, Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, and the person it's found by teams supporting that person that they do need long-term supports, then the employment services with the home and community-based waiver can be activated to help that person in the long term. And so the classic supports that we looked at before with ticket to work and eligibility through our supplemental security slash social security eligibilities, when those are when the short-term supports are done, the long-term supports take over. And that is why you'll see in our regulations and in our practices that we require the person to open a case with DVR and get their supports and then transition to waiver support. And that is why it works like that. So interesting to know. All right, more about systems, employment first. This was systems change that is centered on the premise that all citizens, including individuals with significant disabilities, are capable of full participation in integrated employment and community life. I know you've heard me say a couple times, and you've probably heard other people say, um, real work for real pay. And that is exactly what people want. And I know we have a logo from a different state here. That's okay. It was available to all states. So it's just a picture to say employment first, nice and big. WIOA of 2014, it was reauthorized the Workforce Investment Act of 1998 and contains important changes to the Rehabilitation Act, an updated definition of supported employment, and it included customized employment where you might see things like job carving or a person being able to do part of a job that others do and part of fitting into it as a part of a longer chain of work in an inclusive setting in the community where it benefits the employer and the person. So a little bit more inclusion and creativity around the edges of what the definition of it is. And this was all incredibly helpful to people to be working. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the history and you've seen a few laws, and hopefully you're starting to get a picture, a bigger picture of employment services in your mind. It became a whole philosophy, a whole kind of selection of topics to rally around as a person involved with an individual experiencing disability who's working or wants to work, an agency, a family member, a professional person, your cohorts, your peers, your professional colleagues. When you think about employment services, we think through this lens of core philosophy. So, what are some core principles of employment services? Individualized support. So, these services are tailored to the unique needs, skills, and aspirations of each person. This means that the work is relevant to that person, is part of their plan for work, part of their plan for self-directing life, interesting to that person, holds their engagement, and positive. Community integration. It encourages employment in inclusive settings rather than a segregated environment. So we when we think about these core principles, we think about people working in places where they are visible and around the community, whatever that may be for that person. It doesn't discount working from home, and certainly not our subsistence activities. But even with these, there's going to be an aspect of engaging with your community somehow. You won't be separated, even if you become, like an artist or somebody who does their work behind the scenes, and then they display it to the public in some way, or it gets displayed to somebody who may be interested in it in some way. So this is still valid as community integration, and it's not very different than many, many other people who are artists might work. So that's how you can sort of tell is this common for other people who don't experience a disability to work like this? If so, even if it's a very unique line of work, there's going to be some history of it and there's going to be a need for it in the community, some kind of a need. So it's going to pass the test of is it integrated or not? Is it inclusive or not? Something like a sheltered workshop wouldn't pass that test because the people are doing work in a room separate from others, and somebody else handles all the business deals and does all the, outreach to the community to get the jobs to do the piecework. So I'm I hope that this sort of paints the picture in your mind of what integrated inclusive settings are. Competitive employment means supporting individuals in obtaining jobs that are fair pay and offer opportunities for growth. So people should be thinking about where they fit in, where they're going to see themselves working in the next couple of years. Is this the job for them forever? They want to learn different skills. Do they have dreams and hopes about what they'd like to do for work? What does that trajectory look like for that person? Very unique to each person. But it's important to have that conversation because maybe people wouldn't have thought of that. Or maybe people outside of that person wouldn't consider the capabilities of a person to grow. But people can and do grow in work. Um, Very, very common for a worker experiencing a disability to grow and to change and to take on more responsibilities and to be very satisfied with work, to be a good teammate and a good coworker and a fun person to be around and to work very hard. So this is the philosophy. We'll have another statement set here for principles of employment services. They take a person centered approach. They focus on the person's strengths, the individual strengths, preferences, and goals rather than a one size fits all model. So if I'm an employer, I can't really say, hey, we have a job that's for all the people with disabilities that work here, and it's right over there, and there you go and do that. That's not really what it is. It's really like, oh, well, what would you like to do? What are some things that you see yourself good at? What would you like to learn? What kind of training do you need to get better? What are some challenges for you? What are some ways that we could support you to do the best job that you can? Those kinds of things are what people, a good approach to a person-centered experience and supports for the individual. Collaboration, working with employers, service providers, and communities to create sustainable employment opportunities. So this is like kind of a how it grows type of thing. You know, People might be starting out and working or in being an employer of people with experiencing disabilities. Um, there's a lot of collaboration in the service of employment services too. Our job coach role will frequently be in the workplace trying to identify natural supports so the person can be included and the coworkers have an opportunity to help that person out like they would most coworkers. Are there some ways that people could stick together and help each other on the job and identify things that are successful for that person, so it all adds up to a more sustainable employment opportunity for one person and maybe even for the next person, or maybe even a whole sort of inclusive tradition within a company, which could happen and has happened and has been very enriching. As you need to think about it, our employment settings should also mirror the community at large. So we've included individuals with disabilities in our community at large. Why not our workplace as well? We've included people in school, in regular classes, with supports, and in special education that is with people who don't happen to experience disability, a lot of the clubs and a lot of the inclusive things that people do. It's been a great experience and it extends to our workplace as well. Also, another aspect is empowerment, helping individuals gain confidence and skills to succeed in the workforce. So, whatever we can do to empower that person to be confident, work more independently as much as they can, and at least to work on skill development so that people feel successful and are seen as successful and contributors to the workplace. Empowerment, ethical practices, ensuring fair treatment, accessibility, and respect for all job seekers. So there are plenty of laws around non-discrimination and ethical practices. I think those would come up under this too. And also being ethical is what you are when nobody's looking. I mean, you're going to have to sort of buy into that mindset and support the success from the get-go, or else it's just not going to work out, especially in our adult, spaces of employment. Um, if we don't really set the stage, then it's difficult for a person with a disability to feel welcome and to be able to learn and really shine and do their work with pride, just like a person who doesn't experience disability um, does their work. So it's got a lot of levels to it, but this is okay because these are our principles. So that's frequently what you'll find in principles, a lot of different ways to think about how they impact people in practice. So now we've come to our section about training requirements for the uh, worker. So there are some new training requirements that are in our newest set of regulations. And let's go on and learn a little bit more about those.